Move on to the second one, and we'll get done in 20 minutes so we can go off to lunch. This talk is by Edward Frady from UC Berkeley, and the title is A Framework for Linking Computations and Rhythm-Based Timing Patterns in Neural Firing, such as Phase Precession and Hippocampal Place Cells.
Cool. Hello? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Paxton Frady. I'm a postdoc at the Redwood Center at UC Berkeley. And I'm going to be telling you about some work I've been doing with Pentti, Kanerva and Fritz Sommer. So I study a connectionist framework called Vector Symbolic Architectures. It's a big umbrella term. It's about doing computation and distributed representations akin to neural networks. And I'll give you a quick overview of VSAs and the fact that they need content addressable memory. And so most of the talk I'll be talking about content addressable memory. And then we'll be introducing a new type of content addressable memory called threshold phasor associative memories. And basically these are vectors of complex numbers, and then I'll show you a spiking implementation of these memories. And the core idea to keep in mind is that in the context of an oscillation, the spike timing of a neuron can be considered the phase of a complex number. Okay, and then finally I kind of show you how to use the vector algebra to think about spatial navigation and then apply this phasor idea to show some emergent properties that we see in neuroscience. Right, so vector symbolic architectures are a large framework of different ideas that kind of came out in the 90s when people were thinking about neural networks and realizing that the traditional feed-forward neural network couldn't do everything. And I think, I've seen here a lot of people talking about deep learning, and there's clearly a healthy skepticism, and it makes sense because there's a lot of things that deep networks just aren't capable of. And so, for example, like, what's the dollar of Mexico? It's a sort of an analogical cognitive problem that, it doesn't really make sense how to design a deep network to solve this problem. And so how could you do this in a neural network? And basically, VSAs give you an ability to do this by defining a bunch of operations. So essentially, like the similarity superposition operations are just what you're used to in neural networks, like dot products and vector addition. And then the essential extra operation called binding allows you to create data structures effectively. And then by manipulating these data structures in the neural network, you can do more traditional types of computation, kind of normal things you would do in computer science, but in neural networks. And essentially, the gist is that you use these orthogonal dimensions in a high dimensional space to encode information. And you need to then decode this information with a cleanup memory. And so, like, these manipulations are noisy, which is good and bad because it's noise tolerant in some sense. But you need something like a content addressable memory to clean up your computations. And so just like there's a large variety of these models, and some are binary, some are real, and then especially this complex one is going to be very interesting. And then if you've never heard of these at all and you just want to kind of get some insight, just check out Chris Elias's work. He has some good examples of how to use these ideas to solve these cognitive reasoning problems, and it's all in a neural network. But just to contrast with that, he does use spiking neurons as well. But this is then the traditional rate paradigm where the firing rate is really what transmits the information. So we recently had a paper describing some recurrent neural networks. These networks called the reservoir computing. And so like the idea is that we can use the VSAs to help us understand what these networks are doing. And so essentially, just like the very simplest version of this is this fixed network, all the weights are fixed, and it's receiving an input stream over time. This input stream is essentially randomly projected to neurons by phi, and then the recurrent matrix kind of mixes around the neural activity over time. And what we show in this paper is that you can essentially think of this as the recurrent network creating timestamp key value pairs. And so every iteration, the recurrent matrix is applied. This creates a new key value pair. And so after you see, here we go. So yeah, after you see M input sequences, your neural activity is this sum of these matrices and the input, and then these matrices are essentially acting as a key, and you can look up the history of your sequence by just dereferencing the key. And so the VSAs are just all about like creating these key value pairs and data structures, and essentially by applying something like a permutation matrix over and over and over, you can just create like a series of timestamp keys. Okay, but then once you have this memory of X, which has all the history, you decode it by dereferencing a key, and then you just have to, you'll get a noisy estimate of the input that happened, say, 10 time steps ago, and then you have to clean it up with a content addressable memory. So like, the kind of starting point is a Hopfield network, and so this has been a long-standing idea in neuroscience about how to essentially store memories in a landscape, an energy landscape. And then if you kind of probe your memory with a partial queue, then the dynamics of the network will clean up the memory or recall other aspects of the memory. And what's great about Hopfield networks is you can do this with just like one-shot learning. But the downsides are they're binary, so you can only store binary patterns. They have a limited memory capacity, and ideally we would like to implement them with spikes. So these are some additional goals we have. So basically, the Hopfield networks is just defined by the outer product learning rule. So these vectors C are just like random +1s and -1s, for instance, and you can store them into a recurrent weight matrix by the outer product. And so every pattern you have, you just sum up the outer products. And then there's an update equation, which is essentially just piping through this recurrent matrix over and over. Okay, but you need this sort of nonlinear function to prevent you from exploding or decaying. So then you just, every time step, renormalize your vectors to back to +1 or -1 after you multiply it by the matrix. And then this will kind of create this content addressable memory. So there's like two branches of extensions of Hopfield networks, and one branch is about these complex phasor networks. So instead of vectors of +1s and -1s, we're talking about vectors of complex numbers. And typically, they kind of fall into these different categories. There's some discrete phasors where the complex numbers are put into bins. And then there's like some other variants where the complex numbers are just, the phase is kept in its continuous phase, but the magnitude is renormalized. So this is just some literature that kind of covers this, and there's some similar models in physics that kind of like how the Hopfield network is related to the Ising model. There's some kind of complex versions of the Ising model as well. And so the difference is very subtle. I mean, the outer product rule is still essentially the same, except you take the complex conjugate. And then instead of this renormalization to +1, -1, you renormalize to somewhere on the unit circle. And so what these guys did a lot of work on the discrete phasors, but you know, some people in the late 80s realized that you don't even have to discretize. So you can actually store essentially continuous values in the phase. And then a second branch kind of extending from Hopfield networks is the idea of making sparse Hopfield networks where you know, only a few neurons are in the active or firing state. And several papers show that this also has a big advantage in that you can store more memories. And so the traditional hot-field network can only store about like 15% of the number of neurons it has as memories, whereas if you use sparsity, you can get up higher. So basically, like the kind of normative model I'm introducing here is just a combination of these two things. So I call them threshold phasor associative memory networks. And so it's just basically a complex phasor network with a threshold. So you can then store essentially sparse phasor patterns without outer product rule. And then you have like a very similar update equation as a hot-field network. And then you have this nonlinear function that essentially preserves the phase, but then either sets the magnitude to 1 or 0, depending on if essentially the inputs are coherent enough to get over the threshold. So here's just like the nonlinearity renormalizing to unit magnitude, or if it's too small, it goes back to 0. And so essentially to control the sparsity, you kind of need this global feedback inhibition. And so if you have some sort of way of measuring the activity of the population and feeding that back as inhibition, you can set the threshold. And essentially this is a hot-field network that follows an energy function with a sparsity penalty. And so essentially this looks like exactly like the real hot-field networks if you just kind of think about the complex numbers differently. So here, like the W's and the H's are all complex, but you know, it's very similar to what the real energy function looks like. And then and then if you add the sparsity, this also in the real networks, this also comes out. Okay. So here's just like an example of how it works. So so essentially, the idea is like with an associative memory, you can provide a partial queue. And then the dynamics of the network will fill in the rest of the queue. So let's play it. Okay, so I just like start the network with this partial queue of the memory, and then I let the dynamics run, and it fills in the rest. And so you can see that it's like very close, not exactly perfect, but very close to this memory. You know, I've stored in a bunch of over 100 patterns in this network with only 400 neurons. And then so you'll see a bunch of these blue curves, which is the network dynamics kind of visualized over time. So I'm just plotting the iterations down the y-axis, and then I'm across here just the similarity of the state of the hot-field network with one of the patterns that I've stored. So in this case, you can see it like rapidly converge to pattern 86 and then stayed stable. And then here just like I color code the phase of the complex numbers by this color wheel. So then just another example is here. So it's a bit harder for the networks to deal with superpositions. So in this case, I'm starting the network off as essentially like 3 of the stored patterns with pattern 22 like just slightly stronger than the other 2. And then the pattern 22 competes out the other patterns and sort of wins. And so this is like the more challenging problem for the hot-field network to solve. And typically, the spurious local minima are these superpositions of patterns. And so you can see in the heat map that like there's these 2 little peaks right at the beginning. And so that's just the indication of those the other 2 patterns. And so then we can just run these networks empirically. We can measure how many patterns we can store and compare that to the phasor networks. And so basically, I'm just plotting here how stable essentially are each pattern as I add more and more patterns into the memory. And then the green curves indicate how sparse the patterns are, and with the black curve being all the neurons are firing every cycle essentially. And so you can see as the sparsity goes down, like we can store more patterns, and then there's possibly a kind of optimal sparsity. But this graph is a little has a caveat in that the threshold might need to be optimized as a function of the number of patterns in the sparsity. And so this is kind of like a shortcut optimization threshold. But nonetheless, you can see that like sparsity greatly increases the number of patterns we can store in the memory. Okay, and so then what we can do with this idea is now put what's really well known in neuroscience into a new context. And so essentially, there have been ideas about this before, about how spike timing can relate to oscillations. And so since complex numbers are related to these circles, the timing of a spike relative to oscillation could indicate the phase. And then there's ample evidence about phase precession in the hippocampus, and that the spikes are aligned to the theta oscillation. So basically, I'm just going to use an integrated fire neuron as the base model. And so this can be parameterized as a little RC circuit with a threshold and a reset potential. You can solve this equation. So this is a fun little calculus problem. Just how long does it take to integrate from the reset to the threshold given a constant current? So this will give us some parameters that I can use to manipulate like the threshold. So this is like the threshold setting. And so then you get these curves like this, which relate the input current to the firing rate. And you can set a refractory period to kind of make this a hard threshold function. And then I'm going to use this kind of basic mechanisms, which is when a spike happens, there's some synaptic delay. The spike causes effectively an instant jump in some synaptic parameter that then decays. And typically, they talk about conductance, but I'm going to be talking about currents because currents are additive. And then, the other thing that happens in this model is that when the spike happens, there's also an inhibitory pulse. And essentially, the excitation and inhibition are tuned so that when these two add up together, you'll get a little sine wave oscillation. And then by adding up a bunch of sine wave oscillations, we're essentially doing this complex algebra. And so the excitatory synapses will be delays. The phases of so all the weights are complex still. And so to do the phase in the synapse, it's also just a delay. So the excitatory synapses will have delays between like 100 and 300 milliseconds if the oscillation period is 200 milliseconds. And then the inhibitory synapses are just kind of at a fixed delay. Okay, so then if you have like a bunch of neurons, what will happen? So here, just like 4 neurons are spiking out of sync. So all their excitation is routed through just this one inhibitory neuron. So these are exactly the same. And then in these two postsynaptic neurons, the synapses are either tuned decoherently or coherently. And so here, the excitatory pulses come in out of sync, and they kind of interfere with each other. And the inhibition kind of quiets everything out. And so there's no spiking in this neuron. Whereas here, all the synaptic delays are aligned to match with this pattern so that they all come in coherently and cause this big current oscillation, which gets you over threshold and causes a spike. And so this is really nice. So just like the fact that phases are delays, and when you multiply two complex numbers, you just add phases. So you can just add the delays. So just having this spike take longer just shifts this little oscillation. And then now the neurons can just perform a dot product. Okay, so now I'm going to show you in this spiking model, essentially this threshold phaser associative memory network. I'm going to do a couple of extra tricks to encode images. Basically, I'm just going to use these sort of random complex vectors to represent each image and store these vectors into the matrix, and kind of use an encoding and decoding matrix to project from the image space into the neural space. So just here are the equations. All right, so so here's like essentially the spiking network. So there's like 1,000 neurons, and I think 50 of them are active, or that's the sparsity. Oops. And okay, and so then these blue spikes are just the initialization spikes. So I'm going to initialize the network to be a superposition of 3 of the patterns, and then just through its own dynamics, it's going to run. And the delays and the time constants and the phases are all tuned so that like an oscillation just kind of spontaneously emerges. And so you can see after about a second that like, this pattern starts repeating over and over. And so here you can see that like what the network's outputting is, it starts off at these 3 patterns, and eventually the one pattern cleans out. And this is just sort of visualizing that over time. And then here you can see essentially like if you could do some electrophysiology experiments on these neurons, this is kind of what you would see. This red is just like the initialization current. And then the blue is the recurrent excitation. The green's the recurrent inhibition. And so this neuron's sort of like getting recruited by the rest of the network and then becomes part of the stable oscillation. Whereas this one gets excited at the beginning, but it's part of a different pattern that doesn't win out, and so it eventually gets suppressed. And then the inhibition from the other neurons kind of overwhelms it and silences it. Okay, so then basically just very quickly, like we're kind of going to try to take this idea and extend it to the hippocampus and just try to explain a little bit more about the oscillations and the spike timing and the place fields that are present in the hippocampus. So a lot of this idea kind of extends from old ideas about the hippocampus where the neural firing is supposed to indicate an index for location. And so essentially in the same way that we index time in this previous work, we're going to use this repeated application of a permutation matrix to index 2-dimensional space. So basically, I mean, just it's very straightforward that we assign the neurons essentially random place fields, but we also will assign them random phases. And then some little bump of activity amongst the neurons is supposed to represent the location of the mouse. And then there's a permutation moves this bump around as the mouse moves around, right? So just all we have to do is define an X permutation and a Y permutation. And then by essentially applying these permutations over and over, we can generate new keys. And then what's really nice about the complex numbers is you can actually do this in a way that's like continuous and interpolatable. So essentially, the idea would be like we would find the code vectors for each point in this grid. We would store those code vectors into the memory, and then that memory would be like a cleanup memory for a noisy position estimate or something. Or you could use it to like update your position. And basically, you can just define these permutation matrices and also raise them to like a fractional power. Yep. Okay, so then if I just, so this is like a very idealized version. Like there's not really the memory here. I'm just kind of plugging in into the spiking model what the spikes would look like if I just follow the rules of this indexing theory. And so here's just a mouse, running around in a box over time, and then here's like what you might record on a tetrode. And then here you can see the neurons just firing at different phases. Sometimes they have a little burst of firing. Okay, and then if you zoom in on these neurons, you can see like kind of the hallmarks of the hippocampus. So like this permutation not only permutes you across the neuron space, it can just permute in the phase space. So you can just design it in a way to capture the phase precession. And so as the mouse moves through one of its place fields, this neuron will start spiking and then also start phase processing, spiking early and earlier relative to the theta oscillation. And then if you just kind of look at where the mouse was when the neurons spike, and you can find place fields. And then what's also nice is, this is a theory, and so this really does represent space, and you can take the population of neurons and then decode the mouse's location from the neural activity. So just to go back over everything very quickly, I introduced you this idea of threshold phaser associative memory networks and all the nice things about them, such as one-shot learning, the increased capacity, the fact that they have rate modulation and that not all the neurons are active, and how you can essentially store real data patterns or analog values in the phases. Then I showed you a spiking implementation where essentially the phases of complex numbers are translated into delays, and I use recurrent inhibition to create this rhythmic oscillation and to maintain the sparsity. And then finally, there's I showed you how to use some VSAs to make index for a two-dimensional environment, and how these basic ideas can be used to understand oscillations and place fields and phase precession in a new framework. So thank you, everyone.
In the interest of time, we'll break now, and you can ask questions of the speaker offline.